Let's talk a little bit about how we interact with images, photographs, paintings, cinema, visual stimulus. Because our eyes and brain can process things we're seeing faster than it can interpret it. Now, this is a survival mechanism, but what often happens then is the way we interact with visuals is we do read it. We just don't know we're doing it because we do it so fast that it's not conscious. It's not an interpretation like it is with reading a text. The trick then is first looking at how do we interact with the visual medium? How do we read it? Then looking at some of the more advanced techniques that people incorporate to guide us through the visual text and understand how we respond both emotionally and intellectually to visual media. So let's look at some examples of what I'm talking about, and I'll give some techniques on how to go about doing that. Now let's start with this image. This is from Mike Nichols' The Graduate. And what happens on a basic level when we first interact with an image is we're going to go to the center. Then we're going to move from the upper left and across, down to the lower left and across. In other words, we're going to read it like we read a page. There's a couple of visual techniques at play that are worth looking at. When we go to the center here, we see, for all intents and purposes, nothing. If you'll look at a later video, Nothing and How to Use It, I'm going to talk about the use of negative space. So I'm not going to get into that here. When we move over to this side of the screen, however, we get one of the first key visual techniques, and that's an eye line. We go to her first. If we're reading from left to right, we're going to see up here, we're going to see what she's wearing. We're going to see that here. So we're going to start with her. She is the beginning of this story. Now, this is from a film. This is from a moving image. But a good filmmaker or a good visual artist is going to think about how we're going to be responding to this and in what order, consciously or not. And so this first technique, line of sight, we start with her and we're guided to him. Now we get there anyway, but the line of sight suggests connection, right? We are being walked through this image, and so we see a connection, but then note the juxtaposition. She is looking at him. He is very definitely, very consciously not looking at her. You probably get the sense that they're connected, that they're together in some way, even though the most reasonable interpretation here would be that for whatever reason, she appears to be on a bus in her wedding dress, and she's looking over at some sweaty, disheveled guy next to her. But that's not particularly interesting beyond why is she on a bus in her wedding dress. When they're connected, when there appears to be a relationship based on that, now it's interesting. So just that simple piece of starting from reading from left to right, but then using line of sight to suggest connection is the first thing that helps us enter into the world of the image. And good visual media will do that. Now let's look at this one then. This is another one that's an iconic image where if we're talking about some important techniques, here we've got several things. Now one, if you'll note, we go to the center of the screen. What's at the center of the screen? Him. His face. Now this gun takes up about a third of the entire image in terms of dominance of space, and yet because he's at the center and he's in focus and the gun is not, even though obviously this is prominent, one could reasonably say this image is about him, because images can be about a number of things. They can be about people, they can be about places, and they can be about things. There's going to be all of that, but something is the dominant elements, the piece that the filmmaker wants us to pay attention to most. And this is a much, a fairly humanized feeling story. In other words, this doesn't feel like an over-the-top Michael Bay action movie. We've got realistic lighting. We've got, things are a little bit dirty and so on. Now note also then the window frame behind him. This is called framing. Pretty simple. The light behind him, the box behind him, this is very much about this person, right? Now, of course it is because he is in the center, but the framing makes a character stand out from the background. It highlights them and often makes them seem bigger than life. Now, this is a scene in which this character is, even though it's through losing his mind, he is finding a sense of power. So by framing him, he becomes physically bigger. But contrast it with this one. This is in many ways an identical image in terms of composition, but we would in no way say that these are the same kinds of story. because of how it's composed. And this is where our interaction becomes really significant in a couple of ways, because now we've got the unrealistic coloring. We've got the literal cartoon in the background. The gun is more over the top. Everything's more over the top. The jacket, the facial expression, everything. This one suggests somebody in the midst of perhaps a bit of a breakdown. This one's crazy. So now we can see just through how the image is composed. These are wildly different stories. We can also get into referencing. So the realism and the naturalism and the framing. We can also get into, so this is from Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, and this is made, just under 20 years after Scorsese's Taxi Driver here. So then we can get into, so this is an iconic scene. Even if you've never seen Taxi Driver or heard of Taxi Driver, in our collective unconscious is the "Are you talking to me?" scene from Taxi Driver on some level. Is this a reference to that? Is this stealing from that? Is this just a cool looking image because that looks cool on film? It's hard to say specifically, but it is reasonable that, again, on some level, this is drawing up memories of that. And now that's not something one would realize necessarily while watching Natural Born Killers, but that influence of art on other art is a part of what we bring to a visual text and how we're going to go about interpreting it. Now, that's not necessarily the motivation, though sometimes it is. I mean, on a simplistic level, the reference, right? The little Easter egg, that kind of thing. But other times, it's something that works. It's something that has influenced the artist, but it's also something that makes it a deeper well to draw from artistically. Consider this from a Carol Reed film, and then this one from a Godard film, and this one from Scorsese's Taxi Driver again. All three are images of men staring into bursting bubbles that represent something that is haunting them in their mind, and they are sort of losing their hold on the objective reality around them. Each made by a filmmaker heavily influenced by the one that came before them. All right, now this next one then, again, we go to the center first, and again, here we have everything. This is convergence. Everything is converging on this center point. This is a very haunting image from Coppola's Apocalypse Now, with the people staring directly at us, which is not something that's something that you have to be careful of in cinema. Staring directly at the camera often people stare just a little bit off because it breaks the separation sense. But here then we have this convergence on the point at the center, all the lines drawing us in a certain direction, which is very, very common to use light and shadow and line to get us to look somewhere. But note then if we go to the center and then just off from it, this can seem like, is this from a primitive scene? Is this from something in another time? And then yet we see here the radio tower, and that might draw us to this over here. And that sets us into an interesting situation of where are we? What's happening? This is clearly at least somewhat modern. So convergence can be used to draw us in. These are characters being pulled into, they don't know what, but they know it's dangerous. This is clearly, you are not welcome here. Here then we can see you can use very little light. Some films that have done this to incredible degrees, like Chinatown or The Godfather, and particularly elements of The Godfather Part 2. And here in the Wachowskis' The Matrix, you can see a bare minimum of actual detail gives us an enormous amount. Here, the use of light and especially just a tiny bit of color to draw us where they want us to go. Now, in this case, by silhouetting the central character, of course, we're going to get there. But we can see then how this little bit of light is the extra piece to kind of get our eye by framing it so close to the center. So this then is just, before I go into a couple of other things, to sum up some of that, this is a little bit you can use to help you walk through an image and articulate what you're looking for. But when I say director, this could be photographer or painter at the same time. What does this artist want us to look at, and in what order? Where does your eye go first? Why do you think that is? Is it just because it's in the center? Is there a burst of color or light? Are there lines guiding you, etc.? How do they use the image? Are they using every space in it? Or are they really only concerned with a certain part of it? And again, negative space, is the negative space actively part of the image, the emptiness part of how we're supposed to feel, or is it just there? And again, please refer to the Nothing and How to Use It video. Then the priorities, the people, the places, and the stuff. One is not better than another, but it tells you what kind of story is being told, which then leads into, what do you think this story is about? Start simply. Is this a comedy? Is this a horror story? Is this sad? Is this happy? Start with just the emotional response that you feel or believe they want to evoke. And then go from there into what kind of story is being told here. Now, just to touch on a few other things in terms of interesting elements of composition, where you can see, again, that here we have several things, both light and shadow. We have framing. We have all these things from Francis Ha. This one that is, again, another iconic image, just an incredible shot from Kubrick's Clockwork Orange. But again, the next video that you'll be looking at, where I talk about the concept of use of quadrants in image and cinema and art. Both of these then make use of breaking the image into a few parts to show different power dynamic, but also to break the image into pieces. Now with this one, look at his face, the central character, and that line through it. It's almost two separate people. It's not that noticeable when it's just the face. But again, this is Kubrick. He was an incredible visual artist, and he is definitely a guy who knew how to use quadrants to break up his images. All right, so then this can be used to accentuate dehumanization, such as this from Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, in which at the center is both void and the computer, with the people on both sides trying to speak to each other. It can create a haunting effect, a certain surrealism. Contrast that with Blade Runner 2049, Denis Villeneuve's 2049, in which it's utterly dehumanized, and yet at the center is a non-human character who is humanized by being placed at contrast with the rest of it. Probably no greater use of framing really in cinema than John Ford, and especially in The Searchers with John Wayne. Ford would actually sometimes make his door frames a little too small to make John Wayne's character literally seem bigger than life. Versus a sort of emptiness surrounding here in Miller's Mad Max Fury Road. So how we interact with the images is going to play a huge role. Convergence, lines, line of sight, light and shadow. How the image is composed is not manipulating us, but rather it's working with our natural way that we interact with an image. By understanding that, we can now move into some of the more intentional and complex techniques that create images in such a way that we have a certain narrative response and emotional response.